Welcome to the 2020 SNAP E&T National Forum session, The Employment Landscape for SNAP Participants in a Post-Pandemic World. That's a mouthful, isn't it? My name is Jessica Shaheen, and I am the Associate Administrator for SNAP at USDA's Food and Nutrition Service. I will be serving as your moderator today for what should be a very thought-provoking discussion. For the last 6 months, FNS has taken extraordinary steps to help those in need of assistance during this unprecedented time. USDA is committed to moving families forward. We know it is not their goal to stay where they find themselves now. As the country continues to reopen, connecting SNAP participants who are out of work to job opportunities is key to avoiding the negative health and economic impacts of long-term unemployment. Over the past 2 months, the economy added more than 2 million jobs with 5 months of consecutive job growth. Connecting SNAP participants who are out of work to employment opportunities will be key to our mutual goal of moving individuals and families forward. I am honored and humbled to serve as moderator for our panelists. We are joined today by 2 leading experts in SNAP who will be speaking with us about the post-pandemic landscape and what it means for SNAP E&T programs. First, we have Ed Boland. Ed is a senior policy analyst at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. His work focuses on state and federal issues in SNAP. I was fortunate enough to know Ed prior to his joining the center when he was a senior policy analyst at California Food Policy Advocates. So trust me, he does know what he's talking about. While there, he advocated for administrative and legislative improvements to food assistance programs and provided training and technical assistance to community-based organizations. He also has worked in public health law, consulting on legal strategies to combat childhood obesity, and was a senior staff attorney at the Child Care Law Center, specializing on licensing, subsidy, and legislative issues affecting low-income families in child care and early education settings. He received his law degree from the University of California, Hastings. We also have Angela Ricciuti. She is the Rowe Scholar in Poverty Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where she studies poverty and the effects of federal safety net programs on low-income people in America. She is an expert in support programs for low-income families, including TANF, the Child Care and Development Block Grant, and SNAP. Prior to joining AEI, Angela was the Deputy Commissioner for Policy Research and Evaluation at the New York City Human Resources Administration. So again, you can see the subject matter experts we have here. And if, like me, you have heard Angela before, you know how fortunate we are to have her with us today. We thank you for joining today's session. As you view the presentations, please ask your questions through the Q&A feature on the Zoom taskbar and add your comments in the chat box below. At the conclusion of the presentations, the presenters will have the opportunity to address your questions. Please remember that any discussions today do not reflect official USDA policy guidance. Okay, so let's get started. Angela, the 2 of you spoke together on a panel just 3 months ago, hosted by the American Public Human Services Association, about how SNAP work requirements and E&T can best respond to support an economic recovery. What has changed in the labor market since then?
Oh, well, first, Jessica and Ed, I just want to say how it's great to be with you today. And Ed, it's great to be back with you. I'm really looking forward to a great discussion. Yeah, so Ed and I spoke with a group in July, and it does seem like kind of like a lifetime ago, for sure. But I remember at that point, I mean, even in July, we were a few months into the pandemic, and so I think we were facing a lot of uncertainty, but we also had a pretty good sense, at least what the immediate aftermath of the pandemic was and how it was affecting employment. And at that time, Ed and I really talked about how we had seen these very large increases in unemployment due to job loss. Much of it was affecting those on the lower end of the income scale to a greater extent. So we kind of talked about all of that. So thinking now, 3 months beyond that, we do actually know quite a bit more in terms of how things have played out. At that time, we were very uncertain if the changes, the loss in employment would be a much more long-term kind of structural change, or if things would bounce back pretty quickly. What we have learned since then, and actually I think I might have a chart to show this, is that unemployment, at least in terms of the unemployment rate, we have seen a pretty sharp decline, which suggests that we have seen jobs come back at a pretty sharp rate. And so on one hand, that can make us feel a little bit hopeful in the sense that some of these jobs have come back and we're seeing people re-enter the labor market. But at the same time, we still are looking at a much higher employment rate than we were experiencing, obviously, leading up to the pandemic. And we still are seeing some of these disparities in who is returning to work. And I know Ed will speak a little bit more to that. But overall, I mean, really what we've seen in the last 3 months is a lot of people kind of still staying on the sidelines who are unemployed, kind of hoping that they will get their former jobs back as businesses, as offices come back online. And so I think what we've seen is that has happened, but it still certainly has not taken us back to where we were before the pandemic. And that obviously has some very important implications for policy.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Angela. Ed, same question for you. What do you see in terms of changes in the labor market?
Oh, Ed, I think you're still on mute.
Thank you.
Oh, yep.
Well, it's great to be back. And Angela, good to see you and talking again about sort of where we are. And it does seem like quite a long time ago when we were looking at things in July. And it's also great, I think, to be a part of this forum. And I really wish it was in person. I've really enjoyed working with employment and training programs, both the state agencies, the providers, and what's been happening in SNAP E&T, I think over the years has been really exciting. So kudos for pulling together a virtual conference, FNS, and I'd love to sort of hear and talk with folks about what your experiences are. So what I want to do is, I think one thing I've learned since we spoke in July is how the pandemic and the sort of fallout from the pandemic has really shone a light on our labor market and employment situations, and in some ways has revealed cracks and shown where there's been different experiences for different folks. So looking at general unemployment or total number of jobs says one thing. What if you can get more data and a better look at what's happening, whether it's geographical or by, as I'll talk about, some demographic looks, you see a very different picture. And I think that really is important for employment and training providers because you tend to be serving a certain demographic or targeting a certain group. So I wanted to share a few things that we do know with 6, 7, 8 months of data about unemployment in the pandemic and post-pandemic era. So this is just looking at the sort of job loss by wage. And so at the Center Round Budget, my colleagues sorted industries by general average wage and kind of broke it down into sort of 3 different groups. You can see in the dark red that the total job loss overall was 8%. But if you looked at the different losses by income level or wage level, you can see a real difference. Higher wage earners lost fewer jobs overall, And I think for our perspective, low-wage workers really did see the brunt of the job losses from the pandemic and the economic responses to the pandemic. In fact, over half of all jobs lost were in that lowest wage group. We can also look at another way of looking at this, and it's just another way of looking at low-wage workers in some ways, which is looking at job losses based on education level. It's a very similar kind of analysis, and it reveals a kind of similar impact. If you have a college degree or more than a college degree, the pandemic was a bump in the road, right? A small 2.5% loss of jobs for that group. That's bad. And as we're learning, I think those jobs are coming back. But once you start looking at just a high school graduate degree or less than that, you see a real deep job loss. I think there's some concern that that job loss is lasting. Those jobs aren't springing. Some of them are springing back, but not all of them, especially given the sort of amount of loss. So that again, for I think E&T programs and SNAP E&T in particular, that's a real important segment of the population. Those are, especially when you look at the low wage jobs, those are SNAP eligible or SNAP households. And they are experiencing the pandemic and the economic aftermath of the pandemic in a very different way than someone like me who has a college degree experienced it in most of my world. I have a final slide that is not from the center's work on this, but I think really illustrates why there's some concern about this. There's another sort of grouping by hourly wage. And again, 3 different buckets. The green line is high wage workers making more than $28 an hour. They're actually a smidge better now than they were in February, if you can see that line. Again, it was a bump. It was a painful bump in the spring, but those jobs have come back. If you're a middle-waged earner, $16 to $28 an hour, you're coming back, and that's great. And that's actually driving, I think, some of the overall unemployment rate declines and replaced jobs. But if you're a low-wage worker, $16 an hour or less, you're that dark line. First of all, you got pummeled in April, almost 50% drop in employment, and you haven't come back that far, and you're trending downwards. So there's some concern about what will happen in 3 months. Could be a different story. I certainly hope that the low-wage earners get their way back, but I think for SNAP employment and training programs, that's our population. Those are the folks we're trying to reach and serve, and many of them are still struggling. So I think the question is, as we'll talk later, how can SNAP agencies and how can employment and training programs reach out to this group that is still, from what we can tell, struggling?
And Jessica, can I just add one more thing to kind of the picture Ed presented? And because it actually in some ways is a little bit even worse, because we know that low wage workers or low income households are less likely to have multiple adults in the household, either because they're unmarried or just for a variety of reasons, but they're less likely to have multiple adults. So if you think of this at the household level, it even highlights how important it is to focus on that group to get them back to work, because they don't have that other adult to kind of to provide that potential for employment or that potential for other income.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you, Ed. Yeah, so you guys have given us a picture of the labor market and the people side of that labor market, which I think is so important. Ed, if we could continue with you, I want to kind of shift to the organizations that can make a difference for these people through the SNAP E&T. So we know that the state human service agencies are more important than ever as the nation responds to the employment and economic needs of Americans at this time. At the same time, we know that states are facing considerable administrative challenges. What trends are you seeing as state agencies face these challenges?
That's an important question. I think my initial reaction is it varies widely. States are in different places, both because of the pandemic, the economic aftermath of the initial pandemic, and their agencies themselves and their programs. But I'll start with, I think, good news, which is I think the flexibility in nutrition programs and in Medicaid and some other basic supports for working families has really been critical for agencies to be able to respond to the sudden changes in circumstances that the pandemic sort of triggered. And the response was great. And that's, praise goes around. I mean, Congress and the administration passed some initial stimulus packages that had these flexibilities, some explicit flexibilities around the administration of SNAP, the administration of Medicaid. FNS, to its credit, kind of went to town and quickly rolled out some guidance, started approving tons and tons of waiver requests from agencies that were slammed. And the agencies themselves, I think, identified what they needed to be able to make sure people got basic food assistance, got or stayed attached to healthcare. So, I'm an advocate. I'm always trying to push government entities to do more and point it out where they're failing. But to step back a second, I think it's really remarkable what agencies were able to do. And I think one of the best examples of that is Pandemic EBT, or PEBT, which is the program that replaces school meals for kids when schools were shut down in the spring. It turned out they could continue some of that over the summer, acknowledging that many of those households still needed help. And we're hopeful that that will be extended into the fall as some schools are still closed or in various hybrid, open, closed, remote circumstances. But that was a program that went from 0 to full implementation in every jurisdiction except I think maybe Guam, where FNS has programs. And it was really impressive and it got a lot of benefits to people who needed them. So, I think kudos for that. And it made me think, so what's the ENT equivalent there? I don't think there is one, but there should be. And some of that's on Congress. I think we need a stimulus that really talks about connecting people to work and supporting some of the training and reconnecting to the workforce. So that's my plug, that we're not done with trying to make sure that we respond to these things. And I think training opportunities is one way where Congress, FNS, and other training programs, federal and state programs, can make a difference. I'll end on slightly bad news with the slide there, because I think from a state perspective, things are tough. They had to close their agencies. They had to work on threadbare staff, often with antiquated technology systems, many of which have made progress with that. And then the states themselves are struggling because their revenues dropped drastically when businesses closed down and states no longer collected tax revenues. So this is just a illustration of the hole that I think many states are staring at right now. And the consequence of having a $380 billion shortfall across states will be cuts in programs. And I think many programs are potentially on the table. I would be concerned about ENT programs that have state funding attached to them, because I'm sure they're going to have to go through a rigorous process in the state budget in order to preserve those funds, but also some of the other programs that are so essential, health programs and other ones that support the very same households, might be facing shortfalls in the future. So a lot to do. I'm impressed with what states have been able to do, but at least the current picture looks like it will be hard for the next couple of years.
Okay, thank you, Ed. And I do think that SNAP ENT has some opportunities there to assist states in that way and be creative. So thanks for the plug. And Angela, same question to you. Do you have some thoughts on any trends as states face these administrative challenges?
Sure. I think it goes without saying that state human service agencies in general are facing a number of challenges, administrative, but also just trying to manage their own workforces and make sure their workforces are safe. And I think it's one of the main challenges is just kind of trying to get our heads around the fact that this is the new normal. I mean, we're 7 months into this. There's really, regrettably, no end in sight. And so I think one main challenge is just, if you're a human service agency, how do you think more long-term, and how are we just going to operate in this environment, given that it's likely going to go on for a long time? So I think human service agencies in general are dealing with that now. When I think specifically about SNAP ENT, I think that SNAP ENT programs are particularly facing a lot of challenges because they have to deal with not only trying to figure out how to provide services in this new environment, following all the public health measures you usually do. I mean, this is a very kind of person-focused business, right? You're training people, you're helping them job search, you're really interacting with a lot of people. So it's very challenging for a lot of these providers to try to figure out how do we do that in this current environment. And then I think the other major challenge, and this is really, I mean, in New York City, we used contracted providers as part of our SNAP ENT, which I know many states do, most states do. And I think that on the provider side, one of the main challenges is how do they change their thinking and their strategy so quickly? So what existed in February in terms of their job development efforts and the skills that people needed and trying to match skills to employers has completely changed. And how do they not only then very quickly reassess the labor market, but how do they also identify opportunities that it might be providing in terms of maybe there's new markets that are going to be created in terms of safety and figuring all of that out. And so, I mean, I can just imagine how difficult that is for these employment service agencies and the human service agencies that are kind of managing and trying to work with them, trying to figure all of that out. At the same time, they're experiencing this huge increase in demand. So I have not identified a lot of solutions, more just a lot of challenges out there, but I think it is important to kind of acknowledge that all of these challenges are out there and really start to talk them through. Again, thinking about this more as a long-term situation rather than I think what many of us thought early on would maybe be a temporary situation.
Well, Angela, I don't think you could have set up the next question for me any better. Your answer is a perfect segue into my wanting to ask about, well, we've started seeing reports of how the pandemic will impact jobs and work moving toward the future, with trends such as a greater reliance on flexible and temporary work, a greater reliance on technology. And so if we can just stick with you, Angela, for a minute, should this change the way that the state SNAP agencies think about the design of their ENT services and the supports they need to offer to SNAP participants? And if so, how?
Yeah, I think it definitely does. I think both on and I get it is very much related to what I just said in the sense of how do you deliver services? That obviously changes. And I know states are figuring this out quickly, as are many other sectors. But right, just how do you provide these services? How do you leverage technology? How do you get that face-to-face time with people? Just how do you even job search in this type of environment? And so I think there are a lot of technology solutions for that. People are figuring it out. I think though a lot of people are still sitting back in terms of job search because it just is such an uncertain time. And I think one of the challenges for SNAP ENT programs is to recognize that and be very aware of people's continued and rightful fear of going out into labor market and not having the protections they need, but also how do they position their SNAP ENT participants to take advantage of job opportunities when they do come up. And I think that is one key challenge, and that speaks to what I mentioned earlier, just about having to get a kind of a review of the employment landscape in many of these areas that have just changed so quickly. And the very successful employment service providers will do that quickly, and they will pull together that information, and it's going to be those providers that have very strong connections to the business community and know what the business community needs, and really listening to the business community and saying, these are the people we need, these are the skills we need. And if the SNAP ENT providers don't see those skills and that knowledge base within their participant groups, then they need to quickly figure out how do they develop that. And again, really focus on positioning those participants so that they are ready and willing to go into the labor market when they feel comfortable doing that.
Okay, thank you. Ed, how about you? What are your thoughts on how state agencies should think about the design of their ENT services in this environment?
Well, I agree with what a lot of Angela said. And I'll just emphasize a few things and then make a point or two as well to add to the discussion. Um, I do think like understanding local labor markets is really important. And I know FNS has encouraged partnerships and talking with workforce development boards and the development of E&T plans, and has really pushed these conversations, which can be hard for a SNAP agency, which doesn't necessarily work in those worlds. And so it's trying to run SNAP, it's trying to run E&T and handle the funding streams and providers. To then go out and be an expert on local labor markets, it can be a bit of a stretch. So I think in the past it was more aspirational, but now it's essential. It's really essential to understand where jobs are, where jobs were but aren't, where jobs are coming back, what kinds of jobs are coming back, and what kinds of employees are needed for those jobs. So that conversation, I think, is really important to have, more so than maybe even beforehand. And that makes me think of the Farm Bill. The last Farm Bill, which seems like a long, long time ago. And sometimes you think, well, you passed something 2 years ago and the world has changed. So whoops, that was maybe not so relevant. But a lot of things in the Farm Bill, I think, are actually really useful now. And the proposed rule that FNS put out on the Farm Bill E&T provisions has a lot of interesting things in it that I actually think are quite relevant, enacting those guidances from the Farm Bill. So for example, the workforce partnerships, encouraging state agencies to work with these entities and identifying what they are, but also rethinking job search, because job search might be more of an important sorting mechanism than it was in the past, when the job market has changed and people's skills might not quite line up to what's available. Also the provision around, like, one of the things I know is always a concern for E&T providers was sometimes they would get someone assigned from a SNAP agency who shows up and is just not a good match. Doesn't have the background skills, not able to get to the time or place where they need to get for the training. And maybe that training won't be in a place anymore. It might be online, but there is always this matching problem. And I think the Farm Bill and the regulations talk about having to reassess somebody who's assigned to something that doesn't match. So like a feedback loop. That's going to be, I think, really helpful to try to get people engaged. And if you miss, because the world has changed so suddenly, there's a chance to reassess, and that would be helpful. Case management now is a critical part of E&T. I think that's a helpful thing if it's done right. So I think all those pieces are hopefully state agencies have begun thinking about implementing them, and there's real opportunity to, I think they really could be really helpful in this environment, rather than, oh goodness, we have to do this thing that doesn't make sense anymore. I apologize. I think some heavy cloud cover just came over, so my lighting has changed. So just a couple of quick points that I also wanted to make, and I have a slide here, because it is really helpful to think of what kinds of jobs are we talking about and how has that changed. So here is a look at the occupations that SNAP, adult SNAP participants tend to have, just an aggregate amount. And I love looking at the slight gray column here. So, but you can see the kinds of jobs we're talking about: cashiers, cooks, nursing and home health aides, janitors, maids and house cleaning services. I think every single one of those has been profoundly impacted. The industry has been profoundly impacted by the pandemic. Cashiers, I mean, I used to like to say, if you go in a store and buy something 4 times in a day, cup of coffee, loaf of bread, extra pair of shoes, one other thing, one of those cashiers is likely on SNAP, because 24% of cashiers participate in SNAP to help support their wages. But how many times do you go into a store 4 times a day now? Not very often. That whole universe has changed a little bit. Cooks, the restaurant industry could look very, very different now. You need a lot more delivery vehicles than cooks and servers possibly, because of the changes in that industry. Nursing homes, I can't imagine what that will look like. Home health aides, and yet still 1 in 4 home health aides receive SNAP while they're working. They may not have the same opportunities in the future that they had in the past. They may need some new training. They may need a new career path. Janitors, I mean, my workplace hasn't been open for 7 months. I actually know they have been cleaning, but that industry is very, very different now than it was. The idea of supporting office work could look very different in the near future. And so those folks will need jobs. Building off of their skills, where can they go? Same thing with maids and house cleaning. So my point is that the most common places that SNAP folks have worked, first of all, I'll also point out many of those are essential workers, right? And they had to work through the pandemic. You know, I think we owe it to them for the fact that they were working, but their worlds have changed. And I think it's incumbent on SNAP agencies and the employment and training programs to recognize that. And if you had a culinary arts program at your community college or at your nonprofit, it could be a great industry. People still want to go out to eat. Maybe that's coming back, but you might have to reevaluate that and figure out, is that in fact going to be the place where people are going to be able to find jobs in the next couple of years versus the next 10 years. So that's, again, a reminder of the importance of connecting to the experts in your communities about where the businesses are and where the businesses aren't, and where the growth is and where the growth isn't. I also just wanted to point out, and this again is another way of looking sort of behind general unemployment rates, but in the next slide, you can see, we sort of know this, but I think it really is helpful when you're thinking of your employment and training programs to keep it in mind that the impact of the pandemic on racial communities has been very, very different. And we've known that unemployment rates for Blacks are often twice as high as unemployment rates for white. That has continued and of course increased over time. Similarly high rates for Latino or Hispanic communities versus white. And so we need to just keep that in mind, because the industries that those folks find jobs in could be very different. But I also just want to raise that we also know from research that USDA did 3 or so years ago, that some of those disparate impacts are even existent in E&T programs. So the research that FNS put out a report on employment and training programs and the characteristics of participants and providers. And one of the things they found was that while like 60% of work registrants, the folks who have to register for work and could be assigned to employment and training if they were mandatory, 60% of that group was white, 30% was African-American, 10% was another other ethnic or racial groups. But if you looked at mandatory employment and training participants, and those are folks who are assigned by their agency to do something and could be terminated from SNAP if they didn't, much more likely to be African American. In fact, 57% of those who were mandatory participants were African American, only 37% were white. So something happens from the big pool of work registrants to the actual folks who are required to participate in a program in order to keep their SNAP benefits. That seems to be disparate, and there could be lots of different factors involved. But I call it out to say that when we're looking at re-upping these programs, re-implementing in communities, we should be aware of those impacts because they echo the impacts in larger labor markets. And I think E&T is a chance to counterbalance them or focus resources or energy to make sure that we're reaching all folks, including those that are most impacted by job loss or unemployment.
Okay, yeah, I think both of you make some really great observations about the connections. It's all about the connections, isn't it? The connection to the employers, the connection to the participants, and where they are at this point in time. What kind of skills do they need in the market when you're thinking about those employers, and how does all of that connect together? I am always struck by the diversity of our work registrants and our SNAP participants. Some of them are working. Some of them have recently worked. Some of them haven't worked in a very long time. And trying to figure out how to serve across those various populations. Speaking of those harder to serve, since the onset of the pandemic, the unemployment rate is starting to fall, but it's still around 10% for those individuals who have fewer skills in education. What can states do to support SNAP participants who are still facing these barriers? How do mandatory versus voluntary programs, you just mentioned that a little bit, Ed, how do they need to be assessed? What do states need to consider as they rebuild their E&T programs to accommodate the new needs of SNAP participants, including ABODs who may be facing such barriers. Ed, let's start with you.
Sure. And I'll start again with another way of looking sort of at specific pieces of unemployment rather than the general rate. So in September, the spike in long-term unemployment, which means looking for work for at least 6 months, was the largest one-month increase on record since unemployment tracking has been happening in the U.S. 781,000, something like that. Folks hit 6 months of unemployment, which of course traces back towards the spring and the beginning of the pandemic. But I think we know the longer you're not working, the harder it is to get back in the workforce. So even when Angela and I were talking after 3 months into the pandemic, I was thinking, maybe job search is more important than it might have been before, because what it really needs, it just needs to be a reshuffling. You need a lot of people lost jobs, a lot of jobs out there, get them back together. So maybe some new approaches to job search, technology around job search could be really helpful in quick attachments. That could be the case, but the trends around long-term unemployment are, I think, more worrisome than that. And it might not be so much of a quick connection through job search, but more of an emphasis on retraining, upskilling, finding the career pathway that's going to work in a community. If you were in a community that was a hub of an airline, you might be facing significant job losses because the airlines have been laying off lots of folks. Helping them find a new job in an airline industry might not be the right approach. However, folks might have skills that could very easily be refitted to jobs that are coming back in other industries or in new opportunities post-pandemic. So again, it goes back to that theme, I think, of how does a SNAP agency know all that, or how does the SNAP participant know all that? It's very difficult to navigate those worlds, but workforce development organizations, job training programs, community groups that have had their work deeply embedded in their communities might have good ideas about where jobs are or could be. And so collecting, sorting, and putting that information into a sort of actionable way could be really, really helpful. And I think something that needs to be a part of planning around employment and training going forward. I guess I can leave it at that.
Okay, Angela, I have the same question for you. And let me just apologize for a second. I have a little problem in my office here that every once in a while, everything just goes blank. So, and it all reboots. So that you may have heard some noises and seen me walk away for a second. I was just trying to get the office its energy back. So, Angela, let me just ask you, what do you think about what states can do to support participants who are facing these barriers, and what they need to consider to rebuild their E&T programs to accommodate the new needs?
Yeah, I do think, I mean, I have a couple, I think, concerns about kind of the direction that we're moving in terms of programs for low-income families and their employment. And by that, I mean, I think that everything Ed and I have set up to this really does present a pretty stark picture for low-income people in terms of their employment. I think my concern is that that will then be used as a justification for just in terms of employment service programs and like SNAP and even other human service programs, to just kind of let people sit on the sidelines, say, oh, the labor market's not good for you right now, just sit it out. And the whole idea of work expectations or requirements comes into that kind of equation. And so I think my concern is that if we take that approach, or if states take that kind of approach, that then that really does, from a long-term perspective, harm those populations, because jobs are available, and especially in certain parts of the country, more jobs are available than other parts of the country. But if we kind of make it easier for certain populations to kind of sit on the sidelines, I think they will be kind of missing a window or missing that opportunity. And then that is what leads to then skill atrophy and long-term unemployment. And you're just kind of setting people up to have even more problems in the long run. And we know, so we did a survey in late July, and I think I have a slide to show this. We know that a lot of SNAP recipients, this is from a survey we did of working age adults, and we asked them if there was a SNAP receipt in their household. And we also asked about their employment situation. So as you can see, SNAP recipients, which are the dark bars, did experience lost jobs and furloughs in their household much more than the non-SNAP recipients. And we also saw that they experienced any negative employment disruption. So that's even beyond just a lost job and a furlough. That's reduced work hours, quitting jobs, all of those. And 80% of SNAP recipients had that in their household. So that's consistent with the picture Ed and I have presented, but to me, that suggests this is a real opportunity for SNAP programs to work with participants to say, we know that you were working, we know you faced a work disruption, we are here to help you get quickly back into the labor market. And I'm hopeful that that will be the message that is sent rather than a message of things are so bad right now, just sit it out. Don't even try, because I think that there is a sense, and it's kind of easy to do that for a lot of reasons. And so again, that's just one of my concerns, and I hope we don't go down that road.
So I think that makes me even think also, Angela, we have a whole lot of new people who maybe have never been on SNAP that are recently attached, and you want to make sure that if they need to get new skills and such, those are the kinds of things. I think your word opportunity is the key word there. We want to take the opportunity, and I also appreciated, Ed, what you talked about in terms of it really is a workforce system. It is about all the different things that we can do, and employment and training is a really important and critical piece of that workforce system. But it is a whole that we want to work with, in those partnerships are so important. Angela, I wanted to follow up just a little bit on to your concern, and I think that maybe this is where we could kind of think about that concern. What do you think the role of SNAP work requirements to help states connect people to employment opportunities might be?
Well, as we know, work requirements for ABODs, or the time limits for ABODs, have been waived at least until the end of the public health emergency, which I believe is scheduled to end the end of October, but I mean, it likely will be extended. So I think that the waivers of at least that ABOD time limit likely will continue. And even beyond that, states obviously have the ability to continue to waive that if conditions allow, even with the proposed tightening of the rules. And so I know a lot of states, and I mean, in New York, we were the same. Sometimes, I mean, the city at least had ABOD time limits and supported them pretty strongly. I think they have a role. I think that setting an expectation for ABODs, so individuals without children in the household, when they are capable of work, if jobs are available, I think the expectation should be that they take those jobs. And that can be a motivation for re-entering the labor market that otherwise might not be there. But I also definitely recognize that some people can fall through the cracks, and when there are not jobs out there, having a time limit when they do everything that they otherwise would be expected to do and still can't get a job, should they be losing their SNAP benefits? Likely not. So I think that places a lot of responsibility on SNAP agencies. And again, I've worked for one, so I know about how that can be. But I think that SNAP agencies really do need to balance the need and desire to help people into the labor market, because as we all know, they are better off working than not working, and just be very careful about the messages that are sent when you are waiving time limits and work requirements, and does that send the wrong message to participants that lessens the importance of work?
Ed, what are your thoughts on the role of the SNAP work requirements in helping states connect people to employment opportunities?
Well, I think it's complicated, and there's a number of factors involved. I mean, the idea of taking away food for failure to work 20 hours or whatever, you know, as the ABOD sort of time limit works out, that might motivate a few people. I think it hurts a lot of people, and that hurt can result in unstable employment environments. So, you know, research is sort of mixed, and it's hard to know what to do. But I'll just flag a few things that I think, you know, are helpful in thinking of how ENT programs and SNAP agencies can approach things. And one actually is just triggered by something you had said, Jessica, earlier, which was like the new SNAP participants who lost their jobs for maybe the first time and turned to SNAP for the first time. You know, jobs are important for income. They're important for self-esteem. They're important for lots of reasons. 12 million folks lost health insurance because they lost their jobs. So I think reconnecting them is very important, but I think they're motivated because of the income, because of the ability to pay rent, because of the need for health insurance and health coverage. So, you know, I think it's important to reflect where people are coming from. And if a person who's lost a job for the first time and turned to SNAP for the first time is probably a little freaked out and can probably use support to feel comfortable landing, to be able to get a job. And that's the way I would encourage SNAP agencies to be thinking about things, is what can we do? Food assistance, one thing, reconnect to health insurance if that's important. Are there other kinds of supports that can be useful? And that's especially for that population that lost jobs for the first time, or just the pandemic really did upturn their lives, and they could very well get jobs on their own if they have the support to do so. I think the other fact to keep in mind, though, is just, you know, there's like 8 million more unemployed workers in job openings right now. It's physically impossible to get everybody a job right now. And so we do need to keep people fed, housed, and healthy so that they can get jobs when there's opportunities to do so. So I do still think it makes sense for states to be exercising their flexibilities and options to get away from reporting work and mandated things right now, and focusing on all these other factors that are floating around, like what's ENT going to look like? What are the characteristics of folks who could benefit from any kind of work supports? And what's going on in our communities as far as where the jobs are? That's a heavy enough lift. And I think it's now's the time to do it. The clock ticks. And so state agencies are threadbare. And my concern is that it takes so much just to make sure you operate the basic program, that some of the things you could do to help people who really just need the support to get, while they're looking for work, to get that work, could fall through the cracks. You know, I had mentioned, I think, this idea of in the Farm Bill, there's this requirement to reassess people if they're assigned somewhere that the provider feels is not a good match. You know, I've heard in conversations with providers that sometimes that mismatch is because of somebody's there because of a mandate. They have to be there. But they don't necessarily feel like this particular training makes sense or doesn't. I'm hopeful with some of these changes that the Farm Bill has triggered, that states can really start to think better about maybe we need to create a new kind of program, because folks who need to get the hours of work because they're subject to the time limit can get those hours instead of sending them somewhere where they're not going to feel like it's very useful to them. So that takes work too, and figuring that out and kind of assessing the individual needs of individuals and matching them to the resources that are available in their communities is a big lift.
And just one other word on this, just because of the work requirements, I wanted to mention, because when I was in New York City in kind of the mid 2000s, we actually did waive the ABOD time limit. And it was very interesting that when that was waived, employment no longer was any part of the discussion with SNAP participants. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. And I think that's where maybe sometimes states think, oh, okay, now it's waived. We don't have to talk about employment at all, as opposed to it really, I mean, employment should always be a part of the discussion, just because employment is the way to help families increase their economic security, whether they have an ABOD time limit or any other work requirement or not. And so I think it's just for states to kind of keep that in mind, that regardless of what happens on the time limits, employment should be a key component of how they're serving their families in SNAP ENT, but also just in their eligibility determination and recertifications, and just kind of re-emphasizing the importance of employment.
I totally agree with that, actually. And that's a good point because, an agency can be gearing people towards work at any time, even now, even knowing that it's a hard thing. It certainly makes sense to say this is the way out, and this is, it might take you longer than you'd like, but ultimately that's what we want. I, I wanted to flag when I mentioned that study about white and black individuals subject to work requirements. That's a really interesting study. And one of the things that I took away from it is the way that the researchers had to describe these individuals were people who believed they were subject to a work requirement versus people who identified as voluntary. And the reason they had to do that is because they didn't even know, the individuals themselves didn't know what they were subject to. And that's just a statement of the need for clear notices and making expectations clear and explaining things, but understanding that it doesn't always sink in the way you might think of. If I'm a lawyer, I could draft a notice that fits my legal expectations that nobody in my household could understand because it's just not geared to where they're at. And I think there's a lot to be done. And I think some states are starting to do this in general around notices and in connecting with clients, kind of the user friendly approach and really testing messages. That would be a really wonderful thing to do in employment and training as well, is how do you communicate with people about mandatory requirements, but broader than that, connecting to workforce, what you need to do. Here's the steps to do it. Here's a form or an online application or an app on your phone that can easily help you navigate those things. I think there's lots of opportunities there. Might be a little bit further out than the immediate responses that so many states are struggling with due to the pandemic, but I think there's a lot of hope that technology can help bridge some of those gaps.
Yep.
I would just go back to the word opportunity, and it does seem to me that we are at a point in time when we have some opportunities to think a little bit differently, to do this in a way and come to that better understanding of the fact that employment and training is not something that is ancillary to SNAP. It is a part of SNAP. SNAP does have work requirements. Employment and training and the connection to that and the message about that we're here to help you move forward in whatever way, where you are today, where do you want to be tomorrow, is really one of the most important things we can be thinking about, and that includes the full picture. And I appreciate your reference to notices, Ed. I don't know if you know this, but we started a notice project a couple of years ago. We have another 7 states that are going through it with us right now, and it is all about improving those notices so that they make sense.
Yeah, I love the tools.
Yeah, and so thank you. I will take that as a plug for the notice project for any state agency that is attending this session. Please check in with us if you're interested in improving your notices. So I guess I ought to move us on. We have 2 more questions that I wanted to ask, and both of them do get to kind of the bigger picture and the federal partners. We've heard from our federal partners earlier in the forum about how states can work together to support families as they move forward to sustainable independence. What can states and each ENT programs do to help families to access the multiple supports that they need? Both of you have talked about the workforce system, about the broad, about employers and employer-driven services, those kinds of things. What can states do to make their programs robust by considering that kind of full picture? Ed, let's start with you.
Sure, yeah. 2 things come immediately to mind. One is I think a number of states have looked at their human service programs through sort of a work support lens and said, we know in SNAP, lots of folks work and they work intermittently and they're in and out of work and they're on and off of SNAP. That's also true for childcare, the childcare system or subsidized childcare if somebody's able to even get subsidized childcare. Work is often confusingly related to that, and healthcare as well. So they've sort of said, why do we make it, why are there sometimes 3 different agencies and 8 different application forms and 4 different periods in which you have to, resubmit for certifications and to reprove eligibility? Can we do something so that from the household's experience, they're turning to the agency for some support, and they get that support because the agency has lined things up in a way so that it works for them? And I think a number of states have been looking at this, and I encourage states to continue to do so. It's a tough, we worked with a bunch of states back 5, 6, 7 years ago on some of these kinds of projects, and it's hard. It's definitely hard sometimes to get 2 different agencies to talk to each other, get regulations and manuals aligned so that the information coming to individuals and to households is consistent and in a way that they can really access, and ultimately reduces the burden of having to do these things so that they can be working or in training or finishing their schooling or whatever the appropriate path is. So I think that's, again, the pandemic highlights the need for that, so that people who do have to retool or do need a bridge of a period of time while they can get a new job or even think of moving because of changes in the economic landscape. I think there's a lot to be done to kind of create those work supports. What can we do to make sure that the people can work, are working, could work, have a chance to work, get the training they need? What are the supports they need underneath it? And then my second point, which I think I have a slide for, is just looking at one of the things I think is great about SNAP ENT, which is the fact that it provides support services for folks that are participating or recently participated in SNAP. And that just reflects what we know about what those individuals themselves say they need to get jobs. So this is actually, I think, from the same study that I referenced earlier, and I'll look at work registrants and ENT participants and the barriers to employment that they identified. It might be a little bit hard to see, but the key things for me are looking at the sort of left-hand side. Health issues are a very significant barrier for some households, and that could be themselves, the potential worker, or another person in the household. The next 2 columns, caring for someone in the household or lack of childcare, I think speak to a general caregiving barrier that the needs to take care of the individuals in your household can sometimes make it difficult to work or gain training. And then transportation, which is a classic ENT challenge in many urban areas. So think of those in terms of the pandemic, right? Health issues, well, that's got to be a paramount concern for lots of individuals. Many of us are working remotely if we're lucky enough to do so, partly because of that. Caregiving, critical on both sides of the question. The caregiving that you might need to do for your own household, your kids in school or not in school, adult members of your household needing help, but also the childcare industry or field, completely decimated by the pandemic. And talk about having to reinvent what they do. Some have stayed open by doing very drastic changes in how that they actually provide services. It's costly, which drives up the care, which makes it more difficult for households to be able to use if they have to pay out of pocket. So just a host of issues that are challenges there. And then transportation, which again, I think of in 2 ways. I think one of the booming or the potentially booming fields of potential employment for lots of folks is delivery services. For restaurants, for any number of things, requires stable transportation. It's always been a challenge for SNAP participants. But likewise, if you have to rely on public transit to get around, for a while that was impossible. And in many places that's back, but there's health concerns as well as reduced access to that. And if, the sort of traditional concerns around reliable private transportation, I think are, as always, very important. And SNAP can address those, in part at least, through its supportive services that it can reimburse for the costs of doing those things. So, it's a great opportunity, a lot of challenges, but a great opportunity. And I think it's an area that's worth a revisit for states that have had, nominal transportation reimbursements, maybe a little bit of childcare, but I think a lot of opportunities to rethink those things.
Okay, thank you. Angela, do you have some thoughts on what states and ENT programs uh, can do to help families access the multiple supports that they need
Yeah,
by working
sure.
across?
Sure, and I agree with much of what Ed has said just about the barriers people face. I think the one issue is that, and again, I worked in New York City, and so we had like 2 million people receiving SNAP, so just a massive program. But and my experience is based on that particular context. But what happened in our system is we had a very robust eligibility and recertification operation, because that's what you need to do, and following a lot of guidelines, a lot of concerns about error rates. So there was really no opportunity to have that discussion about employment and about barriers and about what does your family need, what other supports do they need. That was just almost non-existent in those interactions, just because of the nature of what needed to happen in terms of determining eligibility. And then, so when you go from that to then, at least for parents of children, we had a voluntary ENT program. I mean, it's such a small share of people that actually then end up in your SNAP ENT programs. In the SNAP ENT programs is where you do have a little more ability to have those kind of conversations and to address those barriers, but it's just such a small share of people that actually probably need that support that reach the SNAP ENT programs. So again, I don't know, I don't have all the answers, because there's obviously a lot of reasons why you have to have that process for eligibility and recertification. But if there was a way to break down some of those barriers, I mean, like administrative or bureaucratic barriers, to have those discussions, and I think of it more of like kind of social work type discussions, to try to infuse that with the need to have eligibility determination. I think that if states could work towards that, it could move families forward in kind of a quicker way. But then I also understand, I mean, I hear from a lot of SNAP agencies and workers that their immediate concern is the food needs of the household, which is totally understandable. And I think though sometimes that kind of misses the bigger picture, that, well, yes, the food needs are the immediate assistance, but how do we get this family on a path where the food needs won't be an issue anymore, in a path that's not just about government assistance, that gets them on a path towards their own self-reliance. And I think that's a difficult way to structure these programs, and certainly could lead to some discussions both at the federal and state level of how regulations, how different things can be looked at to allow those kind of conversations to happen.
We could talk for another hour or two on that subject alone, I think, Angela, but thank you. That is very helpful. I have one last question for you guys, and this one is really important even to me personally. I am wondering what you think the federal role, and so that includes USDA's role, should be in supporting the ability of SNAP participants to re-engage with the labor market post-COVID. What is it that we can do to help? Oh, let's start with you, Angela.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I'm kind of like thinking about what the federal government can do. And a lot of it really is kind of just setting expectations and messaging. I mean, obviously there's additional resources that can be provided. I think that's always part of it. But even beyond that, it's really trying to strengthen all of these connections that we've talked about today, and really thinking holistically about SNAP households, not as just a household that's coming to this government agency because they need help with their immediate food needs, thinking of them more holistically. They're coming to our agency because they need help, and we can do more than just provide for their immediate food needs. We can get them on a path. And so at the federal level, I think it's just a recognition that while all of the things that these agencies are doing are critically important and we need to be monitoring all of them, we also need to be supporting that kind of an interaction and that kind of an environment at these state agencies.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Ed?
Yeah, I think that, that's largely on point. I mean, it is helpful for me to always remember that the sort of specific to the pandemic, the impacts are different in different areas. There's no denying that. And so I think flexibility for states is important. I also know from working with food banks a lot over the last few months that there are still places where people are spending hours and hours in line to get food. So to the point of making sure people's immediate needs are taken care of, I think the federal government can do something and can do a good job of making sure that's met. Nobody's looking for a job when they're waiting in line for 2.5 hours. So if we can take care of immediate needs, it does allow a little more space, I think, for thinking long term. If you're spending 2.5 hours waiting for food and you're worried about rent and you're worried about the health of somebody in your household, that can consume a day easily. So I think there's a great role for the federal government. And I'll include Congress. I think Congress should do more. I mentioned that before. I do think there's an opportunity to say, it might not be the same set of things that the first stimulus bill did. I do think job training and supports for people to get back into work, recognizing how the labor market is different for different people, especially low income people in a lot of communities of color, can help target where some of that goes. But I think that's really critical. And then I think I'll just flag, I'm sure many of you know the National Skills Coalition, they do great work. They had recently put out a sort of plan, I think called Skills for an Inclusive Economic Recovery, that I urge people to take a look at, because I think it does a good job of breaking out like sort of what do we need to think about. And it actually echoes a lot of what Angela and I were talking about today. And it starts with a sort of safety net that covers everyone, that thinks about retraining and reemployment for everyone. It mentions public job creation, which I think makes a lot of sense, maybe in a targeted way. Supporting businesses, preventing layoffs if possible, so that people stay attached. That's still happening now. There's been a second round of layoffs and people reemployed who have lost employment. You want to prevent that because that is dispiriting, as well as all the problems of an initial layoff. Partnerships, which we've talked a lot about, digital access, which I think again is the opportunity as well as essential if things are going to stay remote. And then they mentioned public data and accountability, which I think is useful because data helps, it's not always the answer, but it helps understand maybe where you should be looking a little more carefully. And given how fast things have happened and how cloudy information can be, I think it's good to always hold that out, that we need good data and we need some accountability for the things that government's entrusted to do.
Okay, so as you guys can see during this section, I've been taking a lot of notes. So
Just go to their website, they'll have it there.
all right, well, we're going to be going to Q&A, but before we do that, I just wanted to thank the two of you so very, very much for your presentation, for your thoughts, for your charts and your data, but most especially your passion and commitment to serving SNAP participants through the employment and training and helping people move forward to better lives. I think it is something that we share as a mutual goal for the people that we serve, and I think y'all's passion came through on this subject, and I just appreciate so much your being here. I do think we went just a little bit over time, so I apologize for that. But at this point, we will be posing questions from the attendees to the two of you that have been collected throughout the presentation. Folks, you can still submit questions using the Q&A feature, and we will now move into the Q&A section.